Fantastic. So I think I can see that people are joining it as we're going. So we'll just kick it off now. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar on Closing the Gap, Tackling Ethnicity Pay Disparities. This webinar will be hosted by myself, Inez, and I am the co-chair of the PRCA Next Gen, a group aiming to sort of support the professionals and budding young junior talent in the PR and comms industry. I am also the talent strategist at the Workcrowd, and this is also going to be hosted by Hanson Search. I'm going to be joined here today by three top thought leaders who luckily already knew each other, which is great because they already have a great connection. And they will introduce themselves. So Effie, if you go ahead here.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Effie. I'm the founder of We Are Warriors PR, which is a PR agency, but I'm also the founder of an AI tool called Lila Assistant. Prior to that, I was actually director of PR and comms at Hearst, which is a publisher of lots of different magazines like Elle, Harper's Bazaar, Men's and Women's Health, and Cosmopolitan. And then prior to that, I was communications director at Bauer Media. So radio stations like Magic and Kiss, but then also magazines such as Grazia. And actually at Grazia, we launched the Mind the Pay Gap campaign, which resulted, thankfully, in the government being forced to introduce reporting measures for the gender pay gap.
Fantastic, thank you. And then we're also joined by Shiraz here. He's the founder of Braver and also People Like Us. Do you want to discuss that?
Yeah, it's nice to see you all. So I run a non-profit organization called People Like Us, which exists to celebrate and support journalists, PRs, and creators from ethnically diverse backgrounds. We do this through 3 events, free support for anyone out there in the industry, and lots of campaign work around the ethnicity pay gap. And Brave is a new recruitment consultancy that puts diversity and inclusion at the heart of hiring practices, but really looking forward to getting into this.
Yeah, fantastic. And then Barbara as well, we're joined by you. She is the chair of the PRCA's Race and Ethnicity Equity Board.
So hi everyone, welcome, lovely to see you all. Yes, I've been with PRCA. We launched in 2020, we launched the Race and Ethnicity Equity Board, which I believe is still the first board of any description in the PR and comms industry, which is focused on racial and ethnic diversity and equity. I've been in PR and comms for 20 plus years through Brownstone Communications, and I now specialise in racial equity training, strategy, change, anything that just moves the needle to where we all know it should be. Now in 2020, the PRCA launched again a first up the Ethnicity Pay Gap report, which is still available, which we're about to update thanks to lovely sterling work such as what Shiraz has been doing. And yes, it was the first at their time. It's something that we have always focused on as a work stream with REEB, which is Race and Ethnicity Equity Board, and it's never going to go away. So I'm really delighted to be talking about it today.
Definitely, great. And just to let everyone know, this will be an interactive discussion, so please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A chat box. I'll try to keep an eye on it and to ask them as we go along, but there will also be 5 minutes at the end, so just get them coming through whenever you like. But let's sort of kick this off, and we'll start with you, Effie. You're obviously very well experienced in the DE&I initiatives and strategies and mentoring people. What has your experiences led you to see and understand about this ethnicity pay gap? And I'm sure some of the people that are watching this are like me, and I was previously completely unfamiliar with this topic. And since speaking to you guys, I feel like I've learned so much. So if you can start discussing this, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, I've previously worked on the gender pay gap, and thank God that we were able to bring about change. But I actually think that, I guess, the reasons and the dynamics and factors behind why we do have these pay gaps are sort of due to quite a few things. First thing is the obvious thing, discrimination, which is both sort of overt and subconscious. And I think that that has continued to sort of play a key factor into, why, there are these sort of stereotypes and biases that lead to unequal opportunities and differences in sort of pay towards different groups. I think The second thing is occupational sort of segregation. So I think certain sort of industries and professionals have been dominated by particular genders or racial ethnic groups. And I don't really think that there's any surprise that we see certain industries and, you know, certain jobs that are sort of dominated by different genders and ethnic groups are more poorly paid. I think the third thing is lack of representation in leadership roles. I think it's something that we've always spoken about. If you don't have representation in the sort of key decision-making places, then we can't see change. And, you know, I still think that there's a long way to go with that. I think the fourth thing is there's been lots of research around self-advocacy. I think women and people from ethnic minorities sometimes don't ask the right questions or are reluctant to actually sort of negotiate and push for, you know, equal pay or higher pay compared to other groups. I think there's something around, particularly for gender, in terms of caregiving responsibilities. So, you know, women find that often in their careers, they're sort of passed up on promotions and stuff like that because they might take time out to have families. I think there's implicit bias. So there's sometimes preconceived notions around what certain genders or certain groups are able to do. And therefore, I think the compensation and the promotional opportunities are often very different. And I think lack of transparency. So people don't really discuss salaries. I think that's probably our biggest hindrance because we don't discuss amongst ourselves. We don't necessarily know that we're being paid fairly and equally. And I think the last thing is systemic factors. I think historically, there has been, you know, things like systemic racism and gender equality. And I think that that has definitely impacted the way that we are unequally paid and treated. And I think until you tackle those sort of systemic and historical biases, I think it's going to be really hard to change it. So that's what I think has really hindered upward mobility for us.
Definitely, absolutely. Shiraz, have you got some comments on this?
Yeah, I think Effie is pretty bang on the money. I suppose in my experience, both going through the agency and in-house life, and then now at the other end, recruitment, a challenge, I suppose that could add to the wider disparities in the industry are companies not publishing salary bands. And the reason that's a challenge, both internally and externally, is I suppose internally, you don't know where you are on the band. So it can be quite hard to figure out where you are and what the next steps are to progress. And yeah, so I suppose if they're not like communicated to you, like reviews process become quite difficult. So going through the ranks myself over the years, I found reviews processes quite tedious at times. The feedback I'd get would be very intangible. And the feedback we've had from countless people we've supported over the years across the industry is quite similar. Like it's really vague feedback, like you need to be more visible, you need to try and like appease clients a bit more. And it's not particularly measurable. So I find like salary bands in one respect, and also externally, it kind of wastes a lot of people's time. So if you, for example, go through an entire interview process and realize at the offer stage that the salary offer is nowhere near where it should be, then you've essentially wasted your recruitment team's time and the candidate's time. So yeah, and also communicating salary bands internally is super important because that way people won't query or wonder whether they're being underpaid. So I think salary bands is a big one and progression. And I think this kind of slightly links to the retention piece, but in terms of like pay rises and promotions, I think a really simple fix that companies could try is like just measuring like who's winning pay rises, who's being promoted, and what you might uncover, and you could do this quite simply in an Excel sheet. Are there any biases at play? Like, as Effie says, are people from particular demographics more likely to progress quickly? I'm sure lots of us over the years have experienced this. There are perhaps favorites of the company who seem to just climb through the ranks, people that might be particularly good. And often that's subjective, which isn't helpful for someone's wider career development.
Yeah, definitely. I've not really thought that much about the whole favourites aspect. That might be some way that it goes completely undercover, that I just assume it's someone's favourite, but actually in reality it has way more underlying factors, definitely. And Barbara, have you got anything to say on this sort of matter?
I have, and I just want to take everyone back slightly to Effie and Shiraz's point about it being systemic. And I think a lot of people are involved who, if you're making decisions about pay and salary and don't realize you are in a sort of, I don't want to say matrix, but I'd say framework or a system that has been around for a very, very long time. So we have to, if we go back to, it doesn't matter how far you want to go back to, but we have to understand in the UK, for commerce, for corporate life, it's pretty much a pyramid, isn't it? So there'll be people at the top and there'll be, the rest of us languishing at the bottom. And I think people have to understand that for a very long time, one of the reasons why we've ended up where we are today, where Effie, Shiraz and I, may not be paid the same as you, Ines, for if we were all doing exactly the same role, is because there is underlying, it's like a subtext for British culture, and I don't want to, sound like I'm bashing Britain, but it's the truth, that if you looked like us, then you didn't deserve to get the same amount of money. And that's not a new narrative. That goes way back. And the sad thing is, everyone goes back and says, okay, back in the bad old days, we know about discrimination, it was bad, but really we should be different now and it should have turned. But the trouble is, it's baked in. It's baked in. So there are people who consider themselves modern and liberal, and on board with EDI, etc., who will still be faced with me and maybe my white counterpart and still think my white counterpart deserves more for exactly the same role. So I think we just have to acknowledge there's a whole subtext at play here that may be unconscious, where you look at two candidates who are identical and you still think, no, I just think this deserves more, and it'll be based on a whole history that you may not be conscious of. So I think we have to be, and that's one of the things why people find this whole topic uncomfortable and they find it difficult, because you have to start delving into really, what are you about and what are your decisions based on? And then you find that, oh, everybody does it, and everybody does it because it's systemic.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a really, really good point. And sticking with you, Barbara, a lot of the work you've done in this area has been relating to the impact on some individuals and society itself. And when we previously had a discussion on this, we sort of spoke about how the pay gap, and it's not really just relating to salary, it's also got a much, much broader impact, which really was quite shocking, again, for me to hear, which I knew of it, but I didn't fully understand the whole capacity of what it could really relate to. So I think it'd be really interesting if you discuss that a little bit further.
Well, absolutely. So really, pay gaps and differences, thinking, I'll get less than my white counterpart by currently the last PRCA census, which I know there's a new one on its way, but the last one from, I think it was 23 or 24, maybe it was 22, put it at 8%, which means I'm being paid 8% less year on year on year on year than my, my non-black or brown counterparts. So that's not actually the end, that's actually the beginning. Because if you, I say, going back to my idea about commerce and our industry in particular being a pyramid, and there'll be billionaires at the top. And I think we all understand, for you to become a billionaire, there's very few exceptions. For you to become a billionaire, there's millions of people below you who they're not having such a great time. That's how you get to be a billionaire. And I'm not bashing billionaires, but that's kind of the truth of it. So the idea is, if they're at the top and we're not having a great time at the bottom of the pyramid, that's how commerce is kind of made. It means that we are going to struggle. Think of it as a pyramid, step pyramid, if you like. Those steps, the social mobility piece is becoming harder and harder for everybody. So that's a general statement about everyone who's not a billionaire. And this is where people say, oh, I've got privilege, I don't understand what it is. So that's true. At that point, we are the same. But how it impacts differently is, if myself and a colleague started as, an account executive, and we're both on, 20K, and we're both working hard, and then the next couple of years, you know, for whatever reason, Sally, let's call her Sally, sorry, any Sallys, Sally gets a little leg up before me. And then so I'm a bit behind, so she's paid more than me. Okay, that's fair, but she's gone up before I have. But when I meet her, I'm not necessarily going to ever be. Once it starts there, you'll find that this happens, it just carries on. And the impact is, if you think about it, if it's 8%, and let's say the difference is 5 or 6K for the first year, that's 12K for the second year, you know, that's 18K the third year. 5 years down the line, there's a 30K difference. And that is massive. That is deposits for houses. That is trying to pay off your student debt. That is if you go deep into your career and you have a family, that means, you know, where you live, where you can send them to school. That means if you can afford, you know, bits and all the extras you need for school, because, you know, sadly, there's no free school really. There's always something to pay. It goes right into, you know, what you can put in your pensions. So there's that, it has the whole societal impact, just that gap. Just you going to work, working your hardest, doing the same as your colleague, but being paid a different amount. And then it broadens out from our industry in terms of when I started my own business. I started my own business with my own money because I absolutely was not going to get any kind of support from anyone, anywhere, but my white counterpart would have done. So there's a gap there in terms of funding. There's a gap there in terms of bank loans. There's a gap in terms of what access you have to any kind of finance. And you see, it just starts to turn into quite a big piece in terms of everywhere you look. Sorry about the sirens. Everywhere you look, if there's a gap, just based on my ethnicity, just based on my background, then impacts the whole path and trajectory of my life, you know, which sounds a bit melodramatic, but it actually affects all of that just from you deciding, oh, I just think Sally's just, you know, she's more visible. As, you know, Shiraz says, she's with the clients more. I'm going to give her like 5 or 6K extra because I think, you know, she's the one. But when that compounds, it has a massive effect.
I think something you mentioned before was that it begins to make people not even try. There might be people from different ethnicity backgrounds. They wouldn't even try because they'd think, well, I'm not going to get this funding to start a business.
Yeah.
But luckily, you guys are all co-founders of different businesses, which is great. But bringing back to the topic, Shiraz, what are your thoughts?
I think Barbara's bang on. The long-term impact this could have, even generationally, is massive. Like over the course of a working lifetime, if you're earning tens of thousands, or even in some cases hundreds of thousands of pounds less over the average working period, that has massive implications, particularly for pension. But I suppose I wanted to touch on the context for right now. I know we did a piece of research last year, and it showed, kind of delving into how the cost of living crisis is impacting different communities. And of course, it goes without saying that everyone is struggling. Like, rates of inflation are stubbornly high, food prices are extortionate, mortgage is completely spiraled. But our research found that whilst everyone was like really feeling pressure, it found that people from ethnically diverse communities were being disproportionately impacted. So people from these backgrounds were more likely to be borrowing money, moving back in with family, and just like the profound impact it was having on their mental health and their well-being. And some people were even, like the people we surveyed, were even skipping meals, just to get by. And that I suppose that puts like people that on the back foot, particularly in our industry, which is incredibly fast-paced. Your currency are your contacts, and if you aren't able to sort of focus well on the work you're supposed to be delivering, it becomes really hard. And it's some good practice I've seen actually around the industry. I've seen a handful of agencies offer sort of one-off payments or even tweak salaries in line with inflation, which I was super pleasantly surprised about. And it's wonderful to see agencies are stepping up and taking their profits and investing back in their staff. Because an agency said, actually, we just want people to focus on the work, not to worry about too much about what they're going to have for lunch or dinner. And I think that was a really wonderful touch, particularly as our industry has such historic challenges with pay.
Yeah, definitely. Effie, have you got anything to say on this matter? We have got a question, but I'm happy for you to talk if you have something in your head.
I mean, I just wanted to, I think like both Shiraz and Barbara have pretty much covered everything, but something that Barbara touched on, and I guess something that I'm really passionate about, is the impact in terms of people becoming founders and people like us actually starting our own businesses. And something that I've been very vocal about is, you know, funding for people starting their own businesses and agencies. And in terms of the stats, I think a lot of people have seen that for women, funding is, you know, 2% as opposed to 98%. For white males, 2% for women, and 0.02% for Black females. Now, that's a serious problem, that if people aren't being even given the chance, forget being sort of paid, you know, the same as everyone else, if they're not even able to start their own businesses, that they can start to create companies and organizations where, you know, diversity is more sort of thought of and sort of weaved into, you know, the epicenter of what that sort of business is about, then we can't change it. And, you know, I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of changing the mindset around funding and giving people the opportunities to start their own businesses. And certainly within our industries, I think if you look across the board, you look at the majority of founders, they don't really look like us. Why is that? Why is it that bigger agencies will back, you know, certain people to start their own businesses, predominantly white, but those people that come from ethnic minorities don't get the same sort of backing, resource, access to clients, support, mentoring, etc. So yeah, I just think it's not just about pay working within agencies, but what about people trying to start their own agencies and starting to change the whole industry?
Yeah, definitely. I remember you saying that when you started with Lila, like you founded your own company, that's great, but then you have to partner with these other companies, and other companies have to be willing to work with you. And if it is just a sort of white man's club, then it could be quite difficult, definitely.
Yeah.
Shall we quickly go on to the question?
Yeah.
Well, from John, we've got one that says, I've heard a number of companies have percentage pay increase caps, generally no more than 15% increase, even for a promotion. This bakes in progressive disparity, which will only ever widen over time if people are started off on lower pay because of their initial salary. What can be done to give people from diverse backgrounds the same confidence/swagger to push for better pay early in their careers? Anyone take the floor?
I mean, I have some suggestions. Definitely, I'm, you know, for this particular audience, and generally my advice has been for a very long time is, and I think we mentioned, I love, you know, Generation Alpha, if that's the right one, and Gen Z and whoever all the other gens are, because they are not going to suffer in silence. I mean, you guys are not suffering in silence. You're saying, actually, let me look at your diversity. Let me look at transparency in pay. Let me look at the market rates. Because back in the dark old days, there weren't many tools for you to compare what the market rate was, what the recruiter said it was. So, but now there's lots of tools that you can look at what the standard pay is and whether you're above and below. So I'd say use those tools and don't be afraid. If you go into an interview and you say, you know, what's the salary, what's the start, and it's a bit below market rate, and they are resistant, it's not the right place for you. Because as you know, as you just pointed out, Inez, it's the start of your career, or John's question, the start of your career, it just compounds. So the swag really is just to go in and ask, and if they're pushing back, that's not the role for you. And walk away and go and find somewhere who are happy to say to you, yeah, in 3 years, I expect you to be on this. In 5 years, I expect you to be on this. And then you can go and confirm it somewhere where there's transparency. So you don't have to have that awful conversation with your friend at work and found out they've been on 10K more than you for 5 years. You know,
Yeah.
so you have to use what you have now, and it's opportunity and AI, obviously, but opportunity to the market and the environment is different, where because of the quiet quitting, because of talent retention, I think whoever's looking for a role now, especially from these generations, are in a much stronger position to say, actually, I want to know what it is. And if they're not prepared to tell you, I say walk away.
Yeah, definitely. Shiraz?
Yeah, I mean, John, if it's ever helpful, point people in our directions. People like us offer completely free support. It's completely confidential. where we're people that have been through the ranks at agency and in-house, worked across sectors, and we are always happy and we're really proud to have helped people negotiate much better salaries and push in. It's always a hard conversation to talk about money. I think culturally, particularly from South Asian backgrounds, lots of my friends from, a variety of backgrounds, I'm always taught not to. So I suppose concurrently, whilst it's really important that we are putting frameworks like the ethnicity pay gap reporting in place, I think it's probably a job between us to also educate people and empower people to ask for more and ask for what they're worth. And it can be uncomfortable, but unless you ask and push forward, like people aren't gonna, I suppose, hand it to you. It's So I think those two things definitely go hand in hand.
Definitely. I think you guys are all part of sort of the movement to help people be more vocal about it, aren't you? Like Barbara, you're in that PRCA group, and Effie, you're a mentor, speaking loudly to anyone, like all of you will speak loudly to anyone who will listen about how we need to make this more vocal and need to make it more spoken about, which is really, really fantastic. Is there any more comments on how to have that swagger and that confidence?
I mean, I would just agree with what both Shiraz and Barbara have said, but I totally understand. Like, we are just not conditioned culturally to talk about it. I just think we've got nothing to lose because the pay gaps are still there. That's the thing. It's like every year we get the reports on the gender pay gap, not on the ethnicity pay gap, I might add, but like it's not really changing. There are obviously some businesses that are doing brilliantly, and I'm so grateful that we have enforced like reporting it so that we can see. But there are lots of companies that just report year after year and just don't really care. So it's for you to care, and you really don't have anything to lose. And if you listen to everything that Barbara said in terms of the impact that it will have on you in the future, in the long term, on your ability to buy a house, start a family, retire, etc., when you know that you've got so much on the line, speak up.
No, definitely. And we've got another question, which is, one of the worst pieces of advice I've ever received was to get a male puppet to attend investor meetings with me to help combat female founder biases. Yikes. In response to Effie's thoughts on investment around female founded companies / minority founded companies, any better guidance on how to approach investment discussions?
Can I be completely honest? I understand, and it's so uncomfortable to admit, but that is the reality. Like, when you know that 98% of investment goes to male founders, and then like the next category is sort of male and female founders. Again, everyone's different, but if you are being strategic, if you want that investment, if going to a VC or going to those investors, that's what you really need, then that is one way to think of it. The other way to think of it, which is kind of what I did and what other female founders have done, is find ways to fund it yourself. And not everyone is in that position, but I would say tap into your network and go to those organizations and those investors that specifically fund female or ethnic minority founders and companies. I'm going to be honest, I think they're far and few between. I think that there's lots of hoops to kind of jump through to get that investment, but there are specific VCs, specific organizations that will just invest in female investors or people who come from ethnic minorities. So if you decide that you want to, go down that route, that's what you should do. Which is harder? The second, 100%. Like, if you want an easier life, I obviously don't want an easier life, then I would say it's a smart move to have a male sort of female team to start most businesses. That's just the reality. That's what the stats say. That is, unfortunately, the reality. But if you don't want to do that, or if you haven't found the right person to partner with, then be brave, be bold, find those organizations, find that support network. They are out there, and just go for it. And there's nothing wrong with failing. That's the thing. I think sometimes people are scared of failing, but you'll never know unless you try.
Definitely. Has anyone else got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, can I just add to that, which is brilliant, that I do some work with leaders on personal branding. And I think if you have to have the male female dynamic, which, as Effie, pointed out, that's a reality. I think it's really important, and maybe female founders don't spend enough time creating a narrative that's really dynamic. It's absolutely, it's an imperative, so people understand that you are the core, because ultimately they're investing in you. So you are the core, you are the center of the universe. It's about you, it's your ideas. And yes, there's a male partner. If they need the male partner for stability, which sometimes they do, fair enough. But just make sure that your song is being heard. It's at the top of the list. It's about you. It's your dynamic. It's your brand. It's your persona. And then if you have to have a male company, so be it. But make sure it's about you, because they're buying into you. And what you don't want to happen is them buying into the male and realize that, it's not really about the guy, it's about the woman. So I just add that.
Definitely, that's great. And we'll quickly move on to Shiraz. You've co-founded People Like Us, which is a not-for-profit supporting media, marketing and communications professionals from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. What made you sort of start in this area? And you have this pay report tool, which is also good. And if you could integrate it into one of the questions that have just come through, which is, how far do you think publishing salaries and bonuses annually could help or hinder this issue? That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So my brother and I been in comms for a long time. So he'd been in it for about 10 years more than me. And I suppose we just got to a point in time where we were just quite frustrated with the state of the industry, and we thought we ought to do something about it. And I suppose the principles we had in mind when sort of tackling conversations around D&I, like one was, I suppose, like Effie and Barbara, like no matter what we do, had to be tangibly helpful. We're not here to play lip service to anyone if you think that's a huge waste of time. And two, whatever we did just had to be fun. I think there's a lot to be said about activism and community that's just engaging, people look forward to, and just brings joy. For me, at least, like I suppose D&I, like in the current climate, is demonized and it's weaponized in many respects by divisive figures in government and like a handful of celebrities and whatever, about being too woke or whatever it might be. But when you break it down really simply, it's essentially giving fair opportunities to everybody. And that's what it's all about. Everyone gets an equal opportunity to succeed, earn well, have a great life, and be happier at work. So I think ultimately, more diverse teams outperform those that aren't. Studies by major consultancies, including Deloitte, McKinsey, have proven that and demonstrated that. And even just anecdotally speaking, like I'm sure everyone in the audience will agree, I'm a lot happier when I'm around a breadth of people thinking in new and interesting ways. And some of the best creative campaigns I've come up with in my career have been around like having different perspectives in the room. Because I suppose the risk is like, if you don't have a sort of like diverse breadth of like ways of thinking, like can approach creative differently, or understand different audiences differently and have that lived experience, you kind of end up relying on stereotypes or end up making mistakes. And that's what we do on, because when you break it down, comms is really, really straightforward. You take an organization's message, you distribute it to a wider audience that are incredibly diverse. Like, 40% of London is diverse, like 20% of the country. And as Barbara said earlier, if it's 8% of our industry is representative, there's a huge disconnect. So that's why we started People Like Us. And we're proud of like the campaign work we've done. And I suppose one of the things we wanted to address was around the notion of visibility. People said, oh, there isn't much diverse talent around the industry, or they're really hard to find. So that's why we created these free events, essentially a showcase of excellent talent. And the other pain point for lots of people in our community is around pay and representation, particularly at getting the most board level. We felt the way to address pay was to create a pay gap study. So we partnered with PR Week to create a pay gap study whereby agencies submit their gender and ethnicity pay gap data. And I suppose for me, at least, whilst the data is incredibly useful, For me, the really like useful part is the context and the learnings. So what every agency does, and you can look it up if for those that have the PR Week login, there'll be a couple of free articles as well. Is actually what's working really well for them and what's been challenging. Like has the market changed? Our amazing diverse talent being poached by folks in-house? Are they leaving for whatever reason? And that's the most important part. Having the data, as like Effie said earlier, and people like kind of year on year, not much change is happening. But I'm really, really proud to see actually lots of leaders in our industry are stepping up, are leaning into the uncomfortable. So it's been a big help. Like I'll say personally, like pay gap reporting isn't a silver bullet. I think there are so many like considerations, whether it's from a retention point of view, pathways to leadership, and also just continue to bring incredible like young talent into the industry and give them a fair shot where they can earn and have a brilliant career in this, fantastic industry we work in. So it's a combination of things. So I think pay is one of them, particularly with keep people around, keep people interested, and making sure they have a great like standard of living. So yeah, measuring pay is one part of a bit of a puzzle, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so many different ways to sort of help prevent these disparities. I remember, Barbara, you said something about you just need to go, if you're someone who's maybe a junior in a company, just go to your management and say, look, I'm not comfortable with this. If you want to discuss that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, people don't feel empowered generally. I think sadly, that's the underlying kind of factor in most cultures. But what I feel Shiraz is just to build on Shiraz's point is we are talking about cultures. Only certain cultures will allow there to be a gender or ethnicity pay gap. Sadly that's reflective of the kind of culture it is. That's the reality. So that when people start looking at, oh God, we can't, because people have said to me, agencies I've worked with have said we haven't got the money to do a big pay gap report, etc. But culturally and I dare I say morally, you should at least have everyone on the same level. If you can't push everyone's salaries up, at least everyone should be on the same level. So I think the way to do that, if you have that difficult conversation, which it happened to me, and you found that your colleague is on a lot more money than you, and it's really, I can't express how awful that feeling is, especially you help each other, you're working just as hard, you're in the ranks, you're in the trenches together, but somehow they still get more than you. You absolutely, and this goes not only for ethnicity pay gap reporting, I'll say this is across the EDI spectrum. If you see somebody being bullied, if you see discrimination, if you see any kind of behavior that we know is not acceptable, the first point should be your line manager or the person above them if it's about your line manager. And the magic phrase I mentioned to Inez before is say, I'm just not comfortable with, I had a chat with Barbara and I'm really not comfortable with the fact that I think she's on a lot less than me and I work together, or I saw the way that you always, push back on X, Y, Z, and I'm just not comfortable with the way that you interact with them because you were really nice with me. We've got to start having more of those conversations, and it's not about your rank in the organization. The only way to change, the people change the cultures. The leaders set the culture, but the people change the culture. And enough people are going to leaders saying, we're not comfortable about this big gap. We're not comfortable. There's no female board directors. We're not comfortable X, Y, and Z. What they're really saying is, and the other half of that sentence is, and I won't be staying if something isn't done because I'm not comfortable.
A really interesting question that follows on from this point, so anyone's free to answer it, is I was in the agency from intern SAM, and I'm now client side. I believe that there is a huge responsibility for a client to demand diverse teams from their agencies. However, a lot of the time, the team who pitches to me isn't the team who actually works on my account. Can you give any advice on how to push for a diverse account team? Effie?
Yeah, so I mean, I've obviously been in-house and something that I wanted to do from a recruitment side, and I totally get it. It's sometimes harder with agencies, is that we essentially had suppliers that worked with us as a business, and I asked them to send me diverse CVs, and the CVs that I got weren't diverse. So I made a choice to find different suppliers. It was simple as that. It was an economic choice. There was, you know, a repercussion for the suppliers or the people that I was trying to work with for not delivering against the brief. So if you brief an agency and you say, I expect my team to be diverse, like, put it as part of your agreement that you expect that team to be diverse. And you obviously have to sort of bear in mind, if you've worked agency side, that people leave and things change and blah, blah, blah. So there is, you know, it's not as cut and dried as that. But if you are starting from the offset saying, I have specifically hired you and I expect, because my brand speaks to a broad audience, which includes diversity, and therefore for you to fulfill the work, I expect you to have an understanding of diverse cultures, etc. If the agency can't fulfill that, it's the same as you setting any other KPI or requirement from your supplier. That's their responsibility to solve that problem and to solve that issue. And I do think that there's a bit of a sort of broader question around DEI, because I think, and I think I said it to you before, I was on a webinar where there was an A missing for action. I think there's a lot more. I think there's a TAAR. I think there's T for targets, A for action, A for accountability, and R for reporting. Like I almost feel as though the DEI part is all about the ideas and the intent, but people aren't doing the doing part of it. So I almost think that we need to sort of reframe how we think about DE&I and think about that second part, which is the actual tangible part that does make a difference.
Agreed.
Is there any other thoughts on this?
I've been in this position a couple of times actually, and I've had two very different experiences. One place I worked, they were quite strict with it. So actually, if agencies are pitching to us, they're not representative, they're not going to be considered, which I felt was the correct approach. If we had such a diverse audience all over the globe, and it wasn't appropriate. And yeah, and I actually think lots of brands are now doing this as part of their pitching process, which I think is a really great and important step. And yeah, another time I had experienced it. I was managing and working with a few agencies, and actually internally and externally with 3 or 4 agencies. I was the only person that looked like me. And yeah, it was quite an unusual and somewhat lonely experience. I thought, actually, what gives here? Why is it this way? And sometimes the approach I took, I had a frank chat with my lead director. We had a very open chat about actually how it makes you feel and how does that represent the brand. And actually they decided to take action after that. So sometimes the right way is to have a difficult conversation and let people know how you feel. As Barbara says, like, let people know what you're comfortable with and actually what that means to you and what that can mean for your wider career. So yeah, so sometimes it's about stepping up and having a difficult conversation. And if ever you want to bounce ideas, I'm sure Effie, Barbara, and myself would always be happy to be an extra pair of ears for you.
Definitely. And I would encourage you all to connect with them on LinkedIn, just in case, to see what's going on with their companies. Have you guys got any last final comments on this subject before, as we have 2 minutes left?
Can I just add that it's a conversation that's in the industry, and whether or not, and maybe it's a thought for everyone at the beginning, middle, or end of your career, whether we as, you know, agents, as the consultants, should be encouraging our clients to not only saying, you know, supplier diversity, but saying to our clients, like, here's your message, here's your project. Did you know there could be a broader audience for you? You know, if your client comes back to you and says, oh no, this is our target audience, it's white male 45 who lives in Surrey, for instance, you know, so actually, you know, Surrey's quite diverse. I think we need to start thinking about encouraging our clients or our teams internally. I've done a lot of in-house saying, you know, there's more out there than just your lived experience. That helps ease some of this as well, because by that very nature, if you're going to a diverse or more diverse audience, not necessarily through a diverse supplier. You're going to have to be diverse yourself, aren't you? You're going to have to look at who's representing that message. It can't necessarily be you.
Perfect. I'm afraid that is time, guys. There are some more questions, but I will try and get the answers and try and get the right person to answer them for you and send you that by email. There will be a recording of this also, so if you do want to share it about, I would recommend that. It would be really good to get the topic out a little bit more, for sure. Thanks again to Effie, Barbara and Shiraz. This was really, really insightful for me, and I'm sure for everyone else. And thank you guys for joining.
Thank
See you
you.
next time, guys. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks.
Is that it?